There is a specific kind of desperation that only a parent knows. The kind where you have watched your child make the same mistake so many times that love starts to feel insufficient as a tool. Where you stop hoping they'll figure it out on their own and start thinking about what you can actually do to fix it. That is the headspace I think Papa Mike Silva was in when, according to rumors that have been circulating in the 90-day Fiancé community for a while now, he allegedly decided to handle the Georgi problem the only way he thought might actually work: with money. This video is about that alleged offer, the rumored sit-down, the supposed bribe, and what I think the whole story, whether it happened exactly as described or not, actually reveals about the Silva family dynamic, about Darcey's specific brand of self-destruction, and about why some people cannot be rescued even when someone is standing right in front of them holding out a lifeline. I want to be upfront about something before we go any further. A lot of what I'm going to discuss today is rumor and speculation. The hot Mike moment at the tell-all, where Mike was caught rolling his eyes and saying Georgi doesn't love Darcey, that happened on camera. That's documented. That aired. But the alleged off-camera negotiation, the supposed cash offer, Georgi's alleged counter-demand, all of that is circulating as community rumor, not confirmed reporting. I'll flag it throughout, but I want you to know going in that I'm not presenting any of this as an established fact. What I am doing is taking the rumor seriously enough to examine it, because even if the specific details are wrong, the underlying dynamic it describes is entirely consistent with everything we've watched play out on screen. So, let's start with what we actually know, and then work outward from there. Darcey Silva has been on our screens for years at this point. She came in originally through 90-Day Fiancé, before the 90 days, then got her own spin-off with her twin sister Stacey, and through all of it, the through line has been the same. A woman who wants love so badly that she will absorb almost any amount of pain to keep the feeling of it nearby. Jesse. Tom. And then Georgi Rusev, the Bulgarian man she married, who became arguably the most contentious relationship of her entire television run, which is saying something. What made Georgi different from the previous situations wasn't just that he was mean on camera, or that the relationship looked bad to viewers. It was that the financial dimension became so explicit and so public. There was a group chat. If you watched the show, you know the one. The moment where Darcey, in a group message that included other people, was essentially negotiating with Georgi about rent money. It was uncomfortable to watch, not because financial disagreements between couples are unusual, but because of what it revealed about the power structure in that relationship. She was pleading. He was dictating terms, and everyone watching could see it, including, presumably, her father. Mike Silva has never been a soft presence in this narrative. He's the patriarch of a family with real money, real business interests, and a very clear sense of how he expects things to operate. His feelings about Georgi were never ambiguous. The hot mic moment at the tell-all crystallized something that had been obvious for a long time. Mike thought Georgi was using his daughter, and he was not particularly interested in hiding that opinion. So here is where we enter rumor territory, and I'll label it as such. The story that has circulated is that at some point, allegedly off-camera, Mike decided that watching from the sidelines was no longer acceptable. That he approached Georgi directly, without Darcey's knowledge, and essentially asked him what it would take to walk away. A debt payoff, a cash settlement, some version of a financial arrangement that would allow Georgi to exit gracefully and disappear from Darcey's life permanently. My honest read on whether something like this is plausible? Yes, actually. Not because I have any evidence it happened, but because it is exactly the kind of move a certain type of businessman father would make. When you come from money, when you are used to problems being solvable with resources, and when you have watched someone exploit your child over and over again, at some point you stop thinking emotionally and start thinking transactionally. If the guy is here for money, the logic goes, give him money and he will leave. It's cold, but it makes a kind of sense. The problem with that logic, of course, is that it requires Georgi to actually want to leave. And it requires a clean transaction between two parties who both want the same outcome. Neither of those conditions, based on everything we've seen, appears to have been in place. The part of the rumor I find most believable, if any of this happened, is the alleged counter-demand. The story goes that rather than accepting whatever Mike offered, Georgi pushed back and asked for more. that he recognized he had leverage in the situation, that Mike's desperation was showing, and that he used it. I want to sit with that detail for a second, because I think it matters regardless of whether it's literally true. There is a pattern in relationships like this one, where the person doing the exploiting has a very accurate read on how much the other side wants things to resolve. Georgi, if this story is even partially accurate, understood that Mike wanted him gone badly enough to pay for it, and instead of taking the exit, he saw an opportunity to extract more. That is not the behavior of someone who ever intended to leave. That is the behavior of someone who has correctly identified that staying is more profitable than going. Now, here's where it gets genuinely complicated, and where I think the emotional weight of the whole story lives. The rumor continues that Georgi told Darcey what happened, and that rather than receiving that information as a warning, as evidence that her father was worried enough to try to buy off her husband, Darcey received it as a betrayal by Mike. I think that's the part that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't watched Darcey for years. How does a person hear, your dad offered your husband money to leave you, and come away furious at the dad? But if you've been watching, you know that Darcey's relationship with the idea of her own relationships is almost completely insulated from outside input. She doesn't receive concern. She receives it as interference, as an attack on her judgment, as evidence that the people around her don't believe in her. There is a psychological term for this general pattern, but I'm not going to pretend I'm qualified to diagnose anyone. What I can say as a viewer is that it fits. It fits the pattern of every conversation Darcey has had on camera when someone tried to express concern about whoever she was with. She gets defensive in a way that feels less like defending the man and more like defending her own decision to have chosen him. Like the relationship has become a referendum on her worth, and any criticism of the partner is a criticism of her for picking him. That dynamic, by the way, is something Georgi would have understood, consciously or not. The more isolated Darcey is from people who can give her an honest outside perspective, the more dependent she becomes on the relationship she's in. It's not a complicated manipulation strategy. It's actually pretty common. You don't have to be deliberately scheming to benefit from it. You just have to be the person who's still there when everyone else has been pushed away. The financial cutoff angle of this story is where I have the most uncertainty. The rumor suggests Mike threatened to stop supporting Darcey financially as a response to her defending Georgi against him. And look, I don't know the specifics of the Silva family's financial arrangements. What is apparent from watching the show is that Darcey's lifestyle, the Miami apartment, the fashion, the general aesthetic of abundance, does not obviously track to a single sustainable income source. Whether Mike has ever directly funded any of that, I genuinely can't say. But the threat, if it was made, would land differently depending on how financially enmeshed they actually are. What I will say is that the Stacey dimension of this story feels true in spirit, even if I don't know the details. Stacey and Darcey are close in the way twins often are, but they are not identical in their approach to the family structure. Stacey has, at various points on camera, expressed skepticism about Georgi that Darcey clearly didn't want to hear. The alignment between Stacey and Mike's concerns, if the rumor is accurate, wouldn't surprise me at all. And that leaves Darcey alone in a very specific way, not just without outside support, but actively having pushed it away. That is the part of this whole story that I find genuinely sad, and I don't mean that in a performative way. I just mean it's sad. She would have been, according to this narrative, surrounded by people trying to help her, and she mistook every one of them for an enemy. Now, let me give the counter-argument its proper due, because I think it's important, and because I actually think some version of it is right. The most charitable reading of Darcey's behavior throughout all of this is that the offer itself, even if real, was paternalistic in a way that was genuinely worth being angry about. Your father going behind your back to offer your husband money to leave is not a normal or entirely respectful thing to do. It treats you as someone who cannot make decisions for yourself. It removes your agency completely. It treats your marriage as a business problem your dad can solve with a check. I understand why someone would be furious about that, regardless of whether the husband is a good person or not. The fact that Georgi may have been exactly what Mike thought he was doesn't automatically make Mike's approach correct. There is a version of this where both things are true. Georgi is using Darcey, and Mike handled it in a way that made Darcey feel like a child who needed to be managed. And when someone already has a pattern of feeling like they have to prove themselves, of feeling like the people in their life don't trust their judgment, that kind of intervention, however well-intentioned, can push them further into exactly the situation you're trying to get them out of. I also want to acknowledge that we are, largely, working from rumor here. There are people in the fandom who will tell you this bribe story is completely true and well-sourced. There are others who think it's exaggerated or outright fabricated. I don't have a way to verify it independently. What I've tried to do is treat it as a hypothetical that's worth examining, because the underlying dynamics it describes are real, regardless of whether the specific meeting happened. It's also worth noting that Georgi has not, to my knowledge, publicly confirmed this story in any specific detail. Darcey has not confirmed it either. Mike has not spoken about it in any interview I've seen. So, we're working entirely in the space of community reporting and speculation, and I want to be honest about that limitation. What the story does, even as a rumor, is illuminate something true about how this situation looked from the outside. A father who was willing to pay money to make the problem go away. A husband who, if the story is accurate, immediately weaponized that offer to secure his position with his wife. A woman who chose the person who had just tried to negotiate a higher exit price over the father who was trying to help her. Those details, whether or not they map to a literal conversation, describe the energy of what we watched on television. The story feels true even if the specifics are uncertain, and that's worth something. There is a version of the Darcey and Georgi story that ends very differently if she hears the information about the alleged counter-demand and processes it correctly. If she hears, your father offered him a significant amount of money to leave, and his first move was to ask for more, and responds with, okay, that tells me something about what he actually wants, the whole trajectory changes. But that's not what happened, on camera or off. Instead, the pattern continued. The defense continued. The isolation from her family deepened for a period, and eventually, the relationship ended anyway, not on her terms, not as a clean exit negotiated by anyone with her best interests at heart, but through the ordinary grinding conclusion that most relationships like this eventually reach. Here is what I actually believe, after following this story for a long time. Mike Silva is not a simple character in this narrative. He's not just a concerned father who tried to do the right thing and was punished for it. He is also a man who made choices about how to intervene that, whether they worked or not, came with real costs to his relationship with his daughter. The bribe approach, if real, reflects a mindset that treats the problem as solvable with the right amount of money. That's not always wrong, but it misread Georgi, and it misread Darcey, and it made things worse before anything got better. Georgi is not a complicated character in my reading. I'm just going to say that plainly. The alleged behavior, if accurate, of accepting information about a private family conversation and then immediately using it to paint himself as a victim to his wife, is not the behavior of a person who is confused about what he's doing. That's a specific play. It worked for a while, and then it didn't. And now he's not on the show anymore. Darcey is the one I keep coming back to, because she had people around her, real people, with real money, with real concern, who were willing to do dramatic and probably ill-advised things to try to get her out of a situation that was clearly hurting her. And she chose the situation. Every time, she chose the situation. That's not a character flaw that makes her easy to write off. It's actually a human thing, a recognizable thing, even if it's painful to watch. The hardest thing about loving someone in that place is that you cannot want their safety more than they want to stay. Mike apparently tried to literally pay the problem away, which says something about how desperate that feeling can get. But even unlimited resources don't fix the part where the person has to want out. Patricia's payoff, as this story gets called in the community, is ultimately less interesting as a story about money and more interesting as a story about the limits of intervention, about what you can and cannot do for someone who has decided, for reasons that are their own, that the relationship they're in is worth the cost. Mike had the money. He apparently had the willingness. What he didn't have, what no one could give him, was a Darcey who was ready to be saved. And that's the part that doesn't get fixed by a bank transfer. That's the part that had to resolve on its own timeline, in its own way, at whatever cost it cost her. Which it did. Eventually, which is something, even if it didn't look anything like how her father had hoped it would go.